This is a series which we hope to expand with a number of people, and I thought of this interviews to really get the story with the new technology on various monks and lay people's practice, primarily from the West. And so the series is basically my life and my practice, and they go together well and are woven together. So we will be talking to Ajahn Pavaro today, who has a lot of history with me, and I'll be asking him about his life and practice. He is visiting at the moment from his base in Thailand. And first of all, let's talk a little bit about that. So what monastery are you at in Thailand these days?
Well, I'm about to enter the sixth month actually in Anandagiri. It's, I call it sort of north-central Thailand. It's in Phetchabun province, in an area called Khao Ko. I start getting tongue-twisted as soon as I... And Ajahn Achalo is the abbot. He's Australian. And typically there are just, 4, 5, 6 monks there, both Thai and foreigner. So yeah, I've been there now 5 full years, a little over, and that's where I'm based. And of course, we travel back and forth to the Wat Pah Nanachat community, and we see other monasteries in the country, but that's my home, you might say.
So this is part of the Ajahn Chah tradition. And this is a branch monastery?
It's, I guess, an affiliated monastery at the moment. As you know, there are some kind of formal requirements to be an actual branch, but yes, it's very much affiliated. We go each year to the memorial gathering at Wat Pah Pong. We stay at Wat Pah Nanachat, and we have very close connections, cordial fraternal connections with the Wat Pah Nanachat community, with Ajahn Kevali, Ajahn Siripanyo, and so forth. So, and that being plugged in like that in Thailand is just wonderful, because you immediately have a fraternity of monastics that you can be with, speak with, learn from, and so it's an invaluable experience, actually.
So you have the horizontal level, the peers, so that are approximately within your reins or slightly more experienced or senior to you, and then the vertical integration in that large sangha, and it's very large. There's something like 330 branch monasteries now in Thailand, and 33 in the West, around the world. A nice symmetry there. 10 times in Thailand what is around the world, but it's probably the largest of the Theravada sort of communities that has arrived in the West. I don't think there's anything like it. There might even not be any equivalent in the Mahayana tradition either. But when you first arrived in Thailand, five years ago, was it? 5-6 years ago?
6.5 years now.
So you didn't stay at Anandagiri, you stayed where?
Well, I arrived as we would typically do. I arrived at Wat Pah Nanachat, got my feet on the ground there a bit, and it was actually the year in which Lumpta Mahabua passed on. So I went to the funeral of that great monk in his home monastery with the Wat Pah Nanachat community, and but I was already slated to accompany Ajahn Siripanyo and a group to Daudam Monastery, which, or I guess is a hermitage really, in the mountains to the west of Thailand, overlooking the border with Myanmar, high in the jungle, the forest there. Even for Thais, I understand, it's almost a miraculous place. I remember being there when Thais would come, and they just couldn't believe that this still existed. So I spent overall about 6 months of my first year in Thailand there. So in fact, most of that time was just with Ajahn Siripanyo. So my early exposure to Thai culture was basically sitting in a very dense forest.
And that forest is really pristine and lots of old growth and full of wild animals.
Yes.
So how was that for a Canadian monk to go into the depths of the Thai jungle, what remains of the Thai jungle? Because Thailand has deforested a significant amount of their forest, maybe 90% of it. And so that area is still remaining pristine and full of the classical wildlife of Thailand. So did you have any encounters?
As I said to you yesterday when we were walking, you quickly transform from somebody who's looking at blackened stumps, seeing bears and everything in Canadian forests, to looking for and at roots and branches and things on the ground and thinking that they're a snake. So that was a big transition. Yeah, I saw my first cobra there. I was just walking down a path, sweeping it, and when I looked behind me at one point, I saw this. Must have been 7.5 foot cobra, just very, very calmly, just crossing the path. It, in my mind at least, it had likely heard me sweeping, felt my presence, and then just waited. And I was, of course, moving at a very steady rate away from it, and then it just slid across, very completely flat, not in any kind of hurry. My senses of cobras that they have no need usually to be in much of a hurry. So that was quite an eye opener. It was actually moving towards my dieng up in the forest. So when I went back there in a few minutes, of course, I'm sort of looking around. And we had a tiger there that year too. Ajahn Siri and I didn't see it, but the man who acted as our cook, that way down below in the settled area, he saw the tiger. And later we saw a wild boar that it had killed, and some tiger fur, because wild boars are pretty stern customers in their own right. There are elephants in the area. An elephant had passed through basically the day before I reached my kuti during the rains, because the prints were all around my kuti. And gibbons, and it's a marvelous place. It really is.
So it's an interesting place for practice. Now this goes right back to the time of the Buddha, 5th century BC, India, and where you're constantly existentially in confrontation with wild animals, and you're very vulnerable, right? You're in the forest. There's no protection. Monks don't carry weapons, and they only have. For their protection, they only have metta, or loving kindness. So did you get some good practice with your metta? Did you existentially have to practice your metta?
Oh, yes. We, when we first went in, we stopped to see Lumpur Piak. I think Ajahn Siri would try to arrange a meeting with a Kruba Ajahn on the way into Dowdam, because for anybody it's a novel experience, let alone for a Farang who's looking for black bears. And Lumpur Biak said, you have to chant the protection chant every day. Basically, when you wake up in the morning before you go to sleep at night. I usually threw in a third just for good measure. I was very diligent with that, and I actually gained in that single experience with that particular chant a sense of confidence in the kind of power and benefit of doing such a thing. Because even when I was staying on the dieng, I remember, it brought my mind again and again and again to my vulnerability, but also to my intentions with relation to the beings that I was living around. And I did feel over time a kind of confidence in me in relation to them, to the point that later on during the rains themselves, there was not once but twice quite a large viper in my kuti, and for a Canadian man, that's an interesting experience. I certainly wasn't going to treat it lightly, so we took it out one day, but that night it was back in, and in that case it was in my there's about a meter wide toilet area, and it was on a corner shelf, and I had to pass it in order to use the toilet. So I'm sort of looking at it. It's not moving at all. It really is probably digesting a meal, staying out of the rain. And I had to think, well, I'm not its prey, and it knows, I think, that I don't mean it any harm. So I used the toilet and did that. I don't think I brushed my teeth that night because toothpaste was an inch away from it. And then I wondered, well, will I be able to sleep and so forth? So I put a couple of precautionary candles. I was sleeping on the floor, and I set the timer for 20 minutes, and I woke up and it hadn't moved a millimeter, so I did that again and wake up again, and I just thought, it's not going anywhere, and so I just continued my sleep. And we took it out the next day. Ajahn Siri got a stick. We had to kind of plan it out, and he got a stick and got it behind the head of it. And then I had a towel around my hand, and I grabbed it behind the head, and he took the tail of it, and we marched it out. And this time we were smart. We put it in a pail. Now you put the tail in first, and then you've got the head, and you've got the lid. And so you, as quickly as you can, you do this maneuver. And then we took it down the hill the next day, and quite lovely when opened up the lid and kind of coaxed it out finally. It took off, and it's not a small snake, but I remember it climbed this bank quite quickly and then just sort of looked at us, and then went on its way. And it's such an elegant creature, yeah. So yes, you do develop a sense of your presence there, and the practice of metta is you can't do without it really. And it was, I think, an important little step in that particular development practice, bhavana, my being there, to feel that confidence. Actually, that was an interesting thing.
When the sun goes down in a big, dense jungle, it becomes pitch black, and you just hear the sounds. And you talked about something called a deepening,
Yes.
which is a kind of a raised platform without much in the way of protection, and you're exposed. And at that time, we suddenly, all of our rational and modern mind disappears on us, and we go back to an earlier type of reality which we evolved in. I mean, most of human history is evolving with a complete close encounter with the depth of the jungle and the night and the vulnerability, and it's a very different mindset. So the spiritual language is good to be with.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not just the animals, but there's the sense of the invisible, that sense of beings that are not visible to us but are somehow present. Do you have any intuitions and feelings about that?
Yes, I've always been interested. I don't have particular facility or gifts with these things, but I've just always been interested and very open to what we would call ghosts and angels and devas and so forth. It just, to me, it's a realm of phenomena that I believe in and just am open to, and of course it fits. It fits exactly perfectly in with Buddhist cosmology. So these sorts of things certainly came to mind during my time there, and they do so even now in Canada and also over the years in Thailand. So that you're with yourself in that silence, but it's not always a quiet environment, as you know. I mean, there are periods. There's a cicada season which can be extremely loud, and there are other bugs and that you get to, especially on the deeing, because you're really outside. Just you have your mosquito net. you're aware of, for instance, when to use a Zhongguan path. You remember you put the candles on, and if you do it too early in the evening, there's a certain sort of bug that just flocks to it, and they all die by the hundreds, and they kind of wreck your candle too because it's burning in funny kinds of ways. So I learned to do my walking meditation later in the evening, and I would often. Because I didn't have a lot of formal chanting experience at that time, I would use that to learn chants, practice them, and actually vocalization. I mean, it brings out some energy, but it also it's you're making a bit of your own noise too, and not just listening to maybe fears that might be kind of being provoked from time to time due to things that you're hearing in the jungle. So it's a way of establishing your presence, a benign one for certain, but certainly it's a way of voicing, giving yourself some voice in that immense jungle experience. You always wonder what the next sound might mean, and then as a meditator, you're always curious to see what that sound evokes. Is it fear? Is it questioning, curiosity? Where does the mind go? So as we know from the great forest masters, meditation masters, they would often send their disciples into sometimes rather dangerous circumstances, where they knew a tiger happened to be living, and without really wanting to live too close to a tiger, I could see the wisdom of that, because you're simply, you fall back on your own resources, but we're given the extraordinary gift of instructions from the Buddha and from living masters of these experiences, and so we have things that we can follow, resources to fall back on and develop in our own way as best we can.
Right, it's a really different experience to be meditating in the forest in a very exposed and vulnerable way, and also a very minimalist lifestyle. You're just collecting your alms at the lower station there, and so it's very different than being in a conditioned building or in a meditation retreat. It's just a very much more immersed and closer to the uncertain, or at least the impression of the uncertain.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in that particular place too, you realize that. I remember Ajahn Siri and I discussing this. If one of us breaks an ankle or something, pretty serious. You get bit by a snake. If you really needed medical attention, I can't imagine getting out of that particular place unless I can't imagine being back. Apparently I set a kind of a record because my father became he's very elderly and became. It was clear that he was approaching his own death, and I think I spoke on the phone at 7 a.m, and I was in Bangkok 2 o'clock in the morning that day, and that was absolute top speed. This is a very difficult place to get to, so it meant that we look after ourselves, but we also are responsible for the other. We need to be able to assist, say, if someone did injure themselves or something like that. So it gives even more reason to be mindful when walking down the slippery during the pansa and crossing, many times this sometimes raging stream, sometimes a very steep flow to it. So everywhere you look, there are reasons to be mindful, to take good care, and also to use the experience in as productive a way as you can. But it gives so much too, and that's something that it's one of the things that makes it very, very special, I think, in the experience of many of us.
Yeah, I remember a passage from the Tao Te Ching about attention and mindfulness, and it was like men crossing an icy stream in winter. And I've had a lot of experience crossing icy streams in winter, slippery ice-covered boulders, and you know what happens if you fall in that icy river. So it's a beautiful lesson in mindfulness. Mindfulness is also has to be at a high state in the forest. There's a constant level of self-protection. There's another level of the small things, that is ants and malaria and things that, and in general, it seems that most monks do not perish through the large things, but almost all monks are assaulted in some way by things like malaria and fevers and the endless species of ants that exist everywhere in Thailand.
I read once that biologists say, without being able to prove, they estimate, I've heard, that something like 15 to 20% of the biomass of living creatures in the world, on the planet, are ants. It's a little bit, I mean, you think of an elephant, and let alone just an auditorium full of people, but apparently this is true. And in Thailand, I have to say, at least becomes more plausible. I think at Dowdam, luckily, ants weren't they aren't such an issue. Ubon is just, wow, it's quite a place for ants. But they're always in the picture, and so there are ways of keeping them out of kutis, little rags of oil or water, or little ditches with water in them all the time. So you do need to look after that, and termites, keeping them away from wooden structures. So yeah, for a Canadian to go into this environment, as you know, it's there are just so many things to begin to factor in. A lot to learn.
And any concerns about malaria?
Yes, although, well, basically dawn and dusk, when mosquitoes might be out, you have to be in your kuti or under the glot, the mosquito net outside. I think we would use sometimes a bit of mosquito repellent, but basically I was finding that remaining, properly protected during those times of the day, it was okay. And then in the middle of the day, not so bad. Because there were just 3 people living in, 1,000 acres or more. It takes, I think, 2.5 hours to get to the next village by motorbike from Dowdam, from the bottom. So, we did not encounter malaria. It has, I think, come up there. These days in Thailand, dengue is, we've had some outbreaks of dengue in our area, which have been quite significant, which is a pretty tough fever.
So I want to jump back to the early days before you were a monk. Talk a little bit about your first experiences, how you encountered meditation or Dhamma. Did you come to Buddhism first, or just meditation in general, or just what? How did you come to it?
It was meditation. When I was maybe 15 or so, I was interested. The days of the Maharishi and the Beatles in India, and there could be far deeper antecedents to that in my experience and that of many. But at least for me, in the 60s, it was kind of on our cultural radar if you're of a certain age. So I did meditate a bit when I was quite young, and it had my interest. I was not a regular meditator, and I didn't have a specific tradition I was focusing on. One thing that was always interesting to me, though, in retrospect, I didn't learn about Buddhism in particular. There wasn't much in the bookstore about, at least in the little town that I lived in. So it was not really on my radar, just kind of Indian/Eastern spirituality, you might say, yoga and so forth. And then I guess with that interest, though, the first course I took in university, an evening course, was on an introduction to Eastern religions. And this is where happenstance becomes something more. It has a little more gravity to it. But sometime in September, we started our section on Buddhism. The instructor was a specialist in Buddhism, so it got a little bit more airtime that term. And it was a once a week course, and I'd literally learned about the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, something about the Buddha's teaching. and I was invited to a retreat, a weekend retreat in Edmonton. I lived in Calgary, Alberta then, and I was intrigued. And well, wasn't that a retreat? Wouldn't that be interesting? You get to experience meditation over a couple of days. Whoa! So I signed up for it, and really the teacher that I met, I had no idea who he or she might be. The teacher I met turned out to be a person of considerable intuitive intelligence and ability. She was an elderly, I guess she would have been in her 60s at the time, Austrian-Canadian woman who, owing to her own charged and deep experience of meditation, much younger, earlier in her life, had gone to India, spent 6 years in India and Sri Lanka studying from pundits and then various masters in that tradition, until she finally encountered, first of all, Tibetan Buddhists in a monastery in, I think, South India, and she moved to Sri Lanka. So she, by the time I knew her, was teaching what we would call a vipassana technique, meditation, and very thoroughly Theravadan in its orientation. And I mean, several things happened in the space of a weekend that if I didn't know it exactly, I did feel that it was transformative. It was something was very pivotal in what had occurred, and that assessment of that time has never wavered. I really think that was when everything changed in my life. And you retain a sense of gratitude for those occasions and the people that are involved, and especially teachers of her caliber. So that's a very special time.
So did you have any intuition that this was a kind of a encounter with something that was almost a quality of family, or like there was a certain recognition of this, or that this was very familiar to you, or in any way?
There are two or three kind of sort of pivotal, transformative elements to it, I guess. One was rather like you're suggesting. One was when I really caught the character, the quality, the luminance quality of mindfulness, and I realized, oh, that's what meditation is. And because I had dabbled in meditation for many years by this, over since I was 15, I was now 26. I suddenly realized, finally, this is a technique that I can work with. This really works. That was one thing, and it was very, very striking for me. Another was realizing later, probably around the Sunday near the time when we were leaving, realizing that I'd met a teacher. I remember her offering a response to some question I had of great urgency, and she, for her, it was the simplest. It was clear that this was terrain that she had known for decades, and I was really stunned. This is absolutely brand new territory, and she'd already discovered and trodden the whole landscape, as it were. And I thought, my God, I've met a teacher, and this is a category of in the whole spiritual parlance as a seeker, which I probably thought of myself as at that time. This was really remarkable. And there's another category as deep or deeper, which was she's a wise person. This is what wisdom looks like. And this is something I'd always been interested in since I was quite young, this interest in wisdom and becoming wise. But I'd never known that I'd encountered it before, so it was made a huge impact on me. And as far as it being, so there was a sense of familiarity with that, I think, feeling at home in the practice, feeling a comfort with the way she structured the retreat itself, and also with her way of interacting with us it was very deep and very wonderful, really.
Right, I met her, I think about 1987, and she's going to go down in Canadian history as one of the first pioneers of bringing Theravada Buddhism. She's quite an impact, and I know lots of rather mature practitioners these days who started with Anagarika Dhammadina. She was quite the character. And was quite well educated in the canon and the commentaries, and had practiced quite a long ways ahead of the generation to formally practice in Asia. So let's go on to this. Started to evolve into your university career, and you end up doing a doctorate in religious studies.
The doctorate is actually in education, but I was able to write about something that was as interesting as I could find to write about, and I was able to find a home in a faculty of education in Edmonton. So, but there's a strong philosophical component, and I was able to use Buddhist background, elements of the worldview, the teachings, as well as quite a lot of interview experience that I had. I recorded interviews, transcribed them, and tried to find in these interviews. There's a theme, as you know, that I was working with, which was existential wonder. My interest was to find something in the Buddhist experience, Buddhist practice, not just theory but practice, that could act as a bridge into Western viewpoints, Western philosophy. Since philosophy has such a kind of prestige within the Western mind, I was looking for this kind of, in order to develop a conversation between not just Buddhist and Western ideas, but some of the depth which gives rise to or informs ideas. So I used the notion of existential wonder as a potential bridge to this experience we call insight.
Mm-hmm. So a connection between these two things. So talk a little bit about what in Western philosophy had any relevance to you in terms of Buddhist practice. Was there anything that connected?
Yeah, I always thought I should be really interested in philosophy, and I was. I loved, I read Plato and other thinkers, but it could be just that I'm not intellectually adept enough to follow in their entirety lengthy arguments that are developed in various schools of Western thought. Some philosophers did interest me, but it wasn't really until I encountered the phenomenological tradition, European tradition that really starts in early 20th century, that I found, at least for my modest abilities, a kind of philosophical home. And so I read, Merleau-Ponty and Martin Heidegger in his phenomenological turn, and tried to find the ideas that were consistent, compatible, and somehow could inform perhaps this dialogue that I was interested in, that I mentioned there. So, yeah, it's what would I say? My philosophical training was not at all formal. It was not systematic, but rather like my reading of literature. I'm just sort of following my nose, and one person refers to another, and I read that person. And some people write better philosophy than others. I mean, David Hume, although I'm wasn't particularly drawn to the Anglo-American tradition, David Hume is a beautiful writer. So I spent a little bit more time with him than others, but it seemed to be the European thinkers, the continental thinkers, that were of most interest to me.
And Hume, he is interesting in that he's probably the first Western philosopher to talk about nous or the absence of self, or his inquiry into his inner being, and he did not find a stable self. So it's very Buddhist, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he might have lost heart just at the very end there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true. It's a very interesting philosophical inquiry that he takes further and further, and he does land this question squarely in the lap of Western philosophy during his life, of whether or not we can legitimately speak of a coherent self. So.
And so you finished your doctorate, and you got a job at the University of Calgary teaching. And what were the courses you were teaching?
Well, I was teaching in the Department of Religious Studies there, which at that time, and perhaps still now, was quite a robust department. And actually, I was teaching well before I gained my doctorate. I did the doctorate in order to try to make sure I just remained teaching, because I couldn't really think of any other way of making a living, I suppose. So the Department of Religious Studies had three focuses to it, themes or elements. I focused on the area of Eastern religions. So I taught the same course that I initially took before I saw Anandagiri. I taught the Introduction to Eastern Religion dozens and dozens of times. And other courses on more particularly on Buddhism, on early forms of Hinduism, and things of that nature.
And so, at some point, now you're a householder at this point, and you have some children, grown-up children, right?
Yes, they were growing up at the time. Started out to be pretty young, beginning in this whole process for me. And two sons, and so by the time I was finishing my university studies, and that they were both in university by this time, pretty much. So I had done my early work in the 80s and been teaching a lot through the 90s, and then started the doctoral program when they were, I suppose, high school and early university years. So yeah, a certain opening, I guess, was arising in my life that I wasn't aware of, and you had a part to play in that, certainly, Ajahn Sona.
Well, let's talk about that. Just tell a little story about our encounter and how that worked out.
Well, we were speaking earlier, and I'm not certain, but it might have been around 1996 or 1997. For now,
so 20 years ago.
Yes. So there was a group of people interested in meditation in Alberta, which started under the auspices of Anandagiri Dhammadina, and all of the years from, I think, the late 70s until even now, in fact, they have sponsored meditation retreats. So in that context, then people in Edmonton brought you 2 or 3 times, I think, to Edmonton for 10-day retreats, I believe. So I went to one of those, as I say, maybe 1996 or so. And it was quite a revelation to be listening to a Buddhist monk who is Canadian, not just a Buddhist practitioner who was very knowledgeable or so forth, but actually a monk as well. So this is definitely a new dimension. We had studied with monks in the past, and Anandagiri herself she called herself Anandagiri, so she was still living by 8 precepts, but I believe she had become a seminary in Sri Lanka in the early years. So we had fairly often encountered monks, and some pretty remarkable monks indeed. Venerable Piyadasi Mahatera, Venerable Ananda Maitreya, 2 really remarkable individuals.
And he was at that time one of the most senior Sri Lankan monks in the world.
Yes.
And highly esteemed, and he had visited Calgary and so forth.
Yes, and stayed with Anandagiri a bit and been on a tour. He would have been, I guess, 70 some pances at that time, 70 years as a monk at that time. He lived until he was 101 or 103 or something. Yeah, so these encounters, even prior to your coming, Ajahn, were, I mean, they impact you in a way that is deeper, and somehow you notice the difference being around someone who's been in the robes for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. They carry themselves, their gestures, the way they respond to any kind of question, just their mannerisms. I mean, your eyes are open watching these people. So those are beautiful encounters. And then when you came, there was this added dimension of a man my age, and but who's been a monk now at that time for quite a while, and this was very important. I can remember I had several friends at that retreat, and we were kind of comparing notes later, and we were all really kind of taken with the way you presented Dhamma in very contemporary terms. And I remember you gave a little story about the smile of Marilyn Monroe, I think. I mean,
Marilyn Monroe, yes.
Yeah.
I used to work her into the Dhamma talks.
But you could work almost anything into Dhamma talks. So yeah, these are great. And then that particular, probably 2 months afterwards, I came to Princeton, where Birken 2, so-called, existed at the time, and spent, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks with you at Birken. That too is a marvelous experience. And again, it didn't conform to what I might think of as an Eastern monastery. It was this place, this sort of farmhouse, basically, with some little kutis, little monastic huts on a piece of very recognizable territory, Canadian, Princeton, that kind of thing. So I was being drawn into the possibility, I think without knowing it in some ways, but into the possibility of making that transition myself.
And you did. So, and it's quite a thing. In Asia, perhaps more common to leave the family life and go off to be a monk. The society celebrates it. Here, it is a strange thing to do. And so there's a lot of uphill kind of resistance to it, but you decided, and having a very comfortable profession, career as a professor, and having a family. How is it to step out of that against all odds into the robes? The ordination was in Canada. The invitation was to Birken Monastery. And so how was that transition? What was the experience like?
Well, I mean, in retrospect, and even at the time, to a large extent, it was just marvelous. But of course, it was very dense and contested at times, and interesting, certainly. And throughout that process, we're all self-referential, and we kind of mythologize our own experience. But throughout that time, I can remember thinking often that by that time I knew dozens and dozens of meditators, people who had been doing this for decades, because by the time I ordained or came to Birken with you, I'd been practicing in retreats for 20 years, and so I had this network of friends, most of whom were really appreciative of what I was doing, even though they recognized that it was it came at cost, not just to myself, but of course to my family, my immediate family in particular. So, but I had in a sense a support group in that way. It was a different experience naturally for the family. My sons weren't altogether surprised, I guess. They their first responses were, "Oh, wow, isn't that interesting?" Or, "Well, it's not like it's a big surprise," and those are the first sorts of things that came that they expressed. My wife, I had a very decent job, and we lived quite comfortably and modestly, and I wasn't in the midst of some sort of rancorous relationship with this wife. not at all. I had what was for all intents and purposes a good marriage. So the leave taking I wasn't trying to leave something behind. I'd opened a door or a window, and I had my attention very firmly on something I was moving into. But it came at the cost of people that I loved and admired, and that comes at a cost. But it's through I think in some ways through our willingness to do these things in life that we also can mature as human beings. Which isn't to say I wouldn't have become, something more of what I wouldn't have matured in ways had I remained in that life. But it was a difficult period in some ways. It took a lot of energy. I'm phoning friends and telling them, introducing what I'm doing, and they're responding as they do, and a lot of giving of the heart and walking people through it. And whether or not it was accurate, but I did see the whole process in terms of it's a novel thing in this world, and I was trying, I guess, to bear in mind that my actions and words and how it was that I did this, to some degree, reflected on the tradition I so honored and loved and was moving into in this formal capacity. So I just did it as well as I could. And would I do it the same now? I doubt it, of course, in retrospect. But I just tried to be as careful as I could. And
You wouldn't do it the same now? What would you do differently?
I don't really know. I mean, I tried to be honest and forthright and kindly in my way of explaining the process to people. And their responses, of course, could be quite amongst, say, my brothers, and that it was a big thing for them to swallow, to get their arms around. And so I can't find fault in that. It's just that's the way it was, and I suppose I might approach those conversations a little differently now, but I'd have to see. So, but the interesting thing was I never regretted it, even through the difficult times. I always thought, oh, what an opportunity, what a blessing, what an honor, and I've every young monk, I suppose, junior monk. Thinks this way and that way, second guesses himself, and we know from living amongst and knowing many, many monks now for decades, sometimes people experience this in different ways, and sometimes there are lingering issues with folks. Elements of this just have never been part of my experience, and I've felt really grateful for that. So I wasn't strategizing through my lay life of how to find myself into the robes. It just, when it actually hit, it was as a conscious thing. It was clear that this was the time. It was like just turning something over and okay. But and that was a surprise to me, actually.
So did you feel like the decision had been made for you in some sense? Was there like no other options? Yeah.
Well, you're very intuitive, and you also have a very good memory. But I used to sometimes explain it like this, because people would always say, "Why did you decide to become a monk?" Or "Why did you decide to become a Theravada monk?" Or on. And I would just say, "Look, it sort of wasn't up to me. The decision made me." That was the way I would turn around.
It's odd in the Buddhist world, because in the Christian world, monks and people explain this as a calling or God, deciding for them, but we don't have a God reference. But there's the same kind of experience of more or less saying, well, I just didn't have a choice. There was some sort of, and I'm not sure that everybody even approves of the new plan that's been established in some part of the mind. There's been a new direction in life set out, and it's somewhat inconvenient because you got a family and a job and so forth. And yet this kind of inevitable, relentless direction is there. It's very interesting how the depth of this.
I mean, I sometimes would. It's like, well, when did you decide to fall in love with your husband? Or well, we don't do. We
Yeah,
don't make
right.
that decision. It's not in that realm of our minds.
Yes. Well, so now you're 13 years in the robes, coming up to 14th. This will be the 14th rains. We call it the rains.
Yes.
And you are also have been to India on a number of pilgrimages, and in fact guided some groups there to the holy sites. And the abbot at your monastery, Venerable Achalo, has got an interesting personality. He is very, we call him faith-oriented, devotional-oriented, and that's an interesting configuration for Western monks. And these visits to the holy sites is also the establishment of certain kind of a raising of faith and a larger dimension of Buddhism than the mere meditation or mindfulness. And so, how does that play out for you? I mean, this whole and very important larger dimension of Buddhism. And what do you feel? Is this what's going to come to the West now?
I think certainly my meeting of Ajahn Achalo has been, and sort of living around him, with him for these years, has been very, very wonderful. And I would say it is, I think, evident when people meet him. He's a different sort of personality. I mean, we're all different, of course, but it's quite pronounced with him, this openness to dimensions of Buddhist life and practice, which aren't always spoken of so much or at all sometimes amongst Western Buddhists, even amongst Western monks necessarily. So that's been really lovely, actually, to be in that environment. And yeah, I mean, speaking personally, but this might ring true with many Western Buddhists listening to this our conversation. But there has been, at least, and maybe still is, but has been an attitude that's fairly prevalent in amongst Western Buddhists. I mean, we encounter it as quite often as an adjunct to the yoga studio, or it's a practice, very much a practice, and people are drawn to meditation because it's relaxing and that. But when people often find their way to a Buddhist retreat, it develops into it has developed into an interest in wisdom, in insight, in enlightenment, and what it is that we can know. So there is a kind of a quality which we would more attribute to a kind of to the head, you might say. All the while, of course, understanding and appreciating that the heart plays a role in practice, but still there is a privileging in our culture in general of the intellectual, rational pursuits, logical thinking, clarity, and less reliance or less presence of the emotional life, you might say. And then, just being a little humorous, but being a Western Buddhist and knowing about Asian Buddhists, and they're so nice. They love the tradition so much, and sometimes we see them, and they bring flowers, and they're always sort of smiling and happy to be with one another, and but they don't. There's always a but there, but they don't really meditate, or they don't really understand meditation, or they don't seem to be really so interested at this time in insight. What they are doing is sort of cultivating their spiritual practice for a future life in which they can find their way to the meditation cushion and sort of do the real practice. So this is a kind of caricature, and it obviously is not going to apply everywhere, and I don't want to offend by doing so. But I think it in my experience, it is somewhat honest to some degree of what we often experienced. So yeah, just coming to Thailand itself has just I live in a different kind of culture. People have a different attitude, and thank you very much, they've been quite happy with their Buddhist practice for, say, 7 centuries. That does make a difference. It's lovely, actually, to see forms of presumption just fall away with this exposure. So yes, Ajahn Achalo, in a sense, typifies the melding of this faith culture with a clear understanding of so much of what we find in the suttas and of interest with regards to wisdom itself. But he, I guess in a way he practices more like an Asian would. I think he identifies himself perhaps with the Asian mentality sometimes more strongly than Western mentality. So this exposure for me has been very beneficial. So the opportunities I've had to go to India have deepened all of this, and I mean the Buddha himself praises going to the four holy sites where he was born, where he became enlightened, where he gave his first teaching, and where he finally passed away into parinibbana. And if you're looking for it too in the suttas, you find instances of this kind, this sort of praise for things which might be glossed over if you're just looking for analysis of the five khandhas or some sort of wisdom teaching. We might not always look for the same things when we're looking in this vast corpus of the sutta literature. I sometimes think, in the Samyutta Nikaya early on, when Venerable Kondanya returns to the Buddha. He's been away for 12 years and he returns to the Buddha, sees the Buddha at a distance and approaches him, and you can just, it's such an evocative scene. He approaches the Buddha, and all it is recorded. This is in the Vangisa Samyutta. All that's recorded is that he bows at the Buddha's feet. He strokes and he kisses his feet, and he says, "It's Kondanya, Lord. It's Kondanya, Blessed One." And this is from an arhat, whom Vangisa described as a triple knowledge man. I mean, he had finished his work. He calls him the firstborn, I think, of the Buddha. Such a beautiful scene, but so tender and speaking so beautifully of gratitude, of devotion, of just loving care. So this mindset, you might say, or the orientation of the heart that we find in Asian Buddhist culture definitely has a role and a place and a voice in the suttas, and it's of interest to me to find some of these things, to see what they do for my own practice. I mean, I'm just interested to become a little more wise in myself, of course, and so being in Thailand and now with these opportunities to visit India a few times has been very valuable. Added to this, I'd have to say something that I don't experience in any profound or I don't have the psychic sensitivities around these things necessarily, but you stand in front of the Mahabodhi temple, or you look at the Bodhi tree, even though it's maybe the 5th or 6th generation, but he was enlightened right here, and you just let these facts sink in. Very, very powerful. Or as I was saying yesterday, you look at the cave in which Sariputta was fanning the Buddha when he finally achieved his final awakening. And you can go in there to this day and sit in meditation before the crowds come and want to get in there too. But these places they resound with some kind of power and truth and beauty that I think we are still at some level sensitive to.
Well, that's a beautiful hour, and we hope to have more of these conversations over time. We now have a fairly rich collection of experienced meditators in the West, and we also have the media and the technology to capture some of these things so that we can share them with other people. So this has been a very nice conversation with Venerable Pavaro, who will soon be returning to the forests of Thailand, and we wish him great success. And we hope to hear more from him in the future. And also, I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up on some sort of recordings and media as well, teaching Dhamma in the near future. So thank you for your participation in this. It's
a good opportunity, Ajahn, to repeat something I said in England, but it's as I said earlier. I mean, it's a marvelous honor to be a monk, and you as a monk, you always think back to your teachers, my preceptor Lumpur Pasano and my monastic teacher Ajahn Sona, and you just in a sense can't repay these debts. So thank you for that important role in my life.
Excellent.